Hi, welcome to Uncommon Courage. It's actually been a while since I've recorded a podcast interview, but I caught up with an old mate of mine, John Kerr, the other day, and he's been going through a bit of a personal transformation, I suppose, which obviously happens to all of us as we get a bit older. But, I thought it'd be worth talking to him about it. We've known each other for nearly 30 years, which is a bit scary. We worked for a PR agency together in our days working in London. And so I'm very, very pleased to introduce you to John Kerr.
Hi, Andrea. It's a true honor and a pleasure to be here and to spend a bit of time chatting about this wonderful and crazy world that we live in. So, look, I know you're a busy woman, so how can we have a conversation about this world?
I'm all about the conversation, John. No, it was really good to see you. I sort of said briefly in the introduction that you and I met nearly 30 years ago, which is a bit scary, right?
Hmm.
At Tex 100, we were both in our 20s having a good time. And now we're in our 50s. Neither of us are working in PR anymore, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I just really felt that the years that I've known you and I've sort of we've sort of popped in and out of each other's lives. Like you caught up with my son Lex the other day, who's about to turn
Hmm.
18. And I remember going to a dinner party with you where I was only weeks pregnant with him.
That's right.
So we sort of popped in and out of each other's lives. So I thought it'd
And
be
we had a mutual friend there who was there that the day my wife her waters broke and my firstborn was on the way to being born. So yes, she's been
yeah.
a while. He's
Yeah,
23
right.
now.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
kind of it's weird, right? All right. So just to give the audience some perspective about yourself, let's hear the journey of John.
Well, I guess like many of us, if you look through the LinkedIn profile, and we're much more than our career, people will say, wow, that 30-year career was really planned out and it was great, wasn't it? But fundamentally, I'm, from a small country called New Zealand, as a boy brought up by a single Samoan mother, in the lower end of the kind of economic spectrum. I was on the wrong side of Auckland, and somehow, through my secondary years, managed to go to the right school, go to the right university, end up with the right degree. But at my core, I'd say I'm still that small town Samoan boy,
Yeah.
as evidenced by the fact that, I'm now the chief of my village, which comes with its own lave and all of the work you need to do to support the villagers back in Samoa. And so, yeah, that journey over the past couple of years, and I'll talk about that later on, coupled with, I guess, the imposter syndrome is what a lot of men talk
Mm.
about, that you look at and you address in the way in which you are perceived and what you think you're doing and how you find your way to happiness and freedom, right?
Yeah. So when you're a chief of a Samoan community, and I know I never say it correctly, sorry. Um,
Mhm.
are there tattoos required with that?
There are. So this is my chieftain band, that one there.
Cool.
And so, for example, the design, the arrowheads are part of the island that I come from, Polo. I've added the thistle actually for my Scottish father as well. And so when you meet another Samoan chief, you can tell whereabouts in Samoa they're from based upon the tattoos. I should have my pair. And I was actually talking to another Samoan guy in Singapore watching the rugby last Saturday, where we were talking about that tattoo that goes from your hip all the way down to your knees, and how that really gives you true mana and true credibility in Samoan society. So at some point, I'll get that as well.
Ah, cool. Okay, but no facial tattoos.
No facial tattoos.
Uh, okay, because there's a really interesting New Zealand broadcaster who's got. Have you seen
Mhm.
that?
The
She's got the
moko,
facial,
yeah.
and yeah, she's
That's
amazing.
very much a Maori tattoo part. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have tattoo all across South Pacific, Maori, Tongans, Tahitians, but yes, the Maoris are quite distinct in terms of the facial moko.
All right, nice. Well, you're my first chief then. So I got a crown tattooed just before we left Phuket, and it's got my boy's initials in it. So I'm the empress of the family. So there you go.
Beautiful.
I'm your first empress. Um, so what struck me the other night? We're all getting older and maturing and all that sort of stuff, although some people don't. But the young John versus the new John. That's what struck me, right? So tell us about the journey and the inspiration along the way. So it's obviously a lot is in your heritage as well as some there was there were some other things that you were saying that told me that it's a lot wider than just your heritage.
Well, yeah, it is. So when I was like I grew up in Greyland, which is primarily a Polynesian area in Auckland, in New Zealand. And my secondary school, I ended up in the North Shore, which is like a lot more Caucasian. Um, And I guess at that point, like I started figuring out how to operate in the two different worlds. So look, I went to university. I was more scared of my mother than anything else, only because the guys in my class were going there. I think there was 30 of us, and 25 of them said they were going to university, and 20 of them said that they were doing commerce. And after the first year, half of them had dropped out, but I was too scared to drop out. So I finished my degree. But look, in terms of New Zealand, back in the 80s and 90s, maybe even a little bit today, if you drank beer, if you partied hard, if you played rugby, if you chased women, you fit in perfectly, right? And I guess that was the template for kind of like how I defined that first part of my career. Even though I came out and surprised everyone, including by myself, with my first job actually being marketing manager for a computer company. In some ways, did I like the job? No. The fact that I was like 22 years old and the next youngest guy in the marketing department was 38, did I like that? No. But I guess with the status and with the money and with the, okay, tick in the box, because that's what you're supposed to do, you feel good about that. And so look, that took me to London, where I transferred with the same technology company from New Zealand to London, and then continued on from there, where I met you in the world of communications. But best way to describe it is that I was following a template. And that template, is the go to university, get a good job, buy a house, find a wife, have children. And there's nothing wrong with that template as long as you're happy with it. But I still remember it was 2016, and I was at a Tony Robbins seminar, and in Palm Springs in the US, and there's 3,000 people, and he starts by going, "Hands up if you're a millionaire," and 90% of the room puts their hands up, and then hands up if you own your own business, and 75% put their hands up, and hands up if you're happy, and 99% of people put their hands down because they're not happy, right? So,
Mm.
so I think gosh, when I was in London, especially, and you know what the hard partying London 90s were like. You fit into a stereotype: pub by two, get home by two, do it all again the following day, live this crazy life because you think that's what you're supposed to do and that's what's going to make you happy. Then one day you wake up having achieved it all and you're like, where's the happiness?
Yeah, yeah. So moving from the unhappy to the more contented version that I'm
Mhm.
seeing before me today. Well, how did that happen from 2016? Or I mean, I know it's been more progressive than that, but
Yeah, well, look, again, Tony Robbins was the first time that I'd been to anything like that. And so, like you said before, we may no longer be in the world of communications or marketing, but I think we truly respect the craft of psychology,
yeah.
and, understanding yourself and trying to figure out, how to make an impact in the right way. And so, going to a Tony Robbins seminar was really the start of the journey for that, for me. Then I found my meditation guru. And when you're in the darkness of your own mind, trying to be still, and there's a lot going on in there. There's a lot of learnings in that as well. And then, look, it just progressed on from there. Vedic astrology I got into in 2022. And, I guess the other part is I'm a qualified hypnotherapist as well. And so when you start, doing hypnotherapy work with people, which, I consider to be part of my healing dharma, you start to realize that this sense of, I guess, self-esteem or self-destruction issues, or there's lack of happiness is it's just the human condition. Maybe it's more of a Buddhist perspective in that as well. But I think once you start to realize that the work that matters most is the work that you do in yourself, you start really saying, well, what do I need to do and how do I need to do it? And then how do I need to make that a priority in a world that's a really busy world, right?
Mm. It was a big part of why I wrote my book. You can see the purple book
Yep,
behind me.
that's it.
It's about my journey to contentment, because I figure it's not necessarily the right journey for everybody else, but it might have a couple of ideas, right? Because the path's so
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, in terms of the formative thinking, there's a book, you've probably read it, called The Body Keeps the Score, about how we process trauma in the human body. And, you start to realize things like, for example, that, my trauma versus your trauma, primarily when we're children, you might look at it and say, well, that's not really that traumatic. But if you're really badly affected by it, it's really bad trauma. And so I think I started, firstly, I started looking at people completely differently. One of my four mantras that I wake up with in the morning um, is that we're all doing the best that we can, and there's no judgment anymore, right? Because again, part of how you're brought up is to be competitive with other people. But once you start realizing that, everybody is, struggling in some way, and I saw this when I was leading the company, especially during COVID. I guess, for want of a better word, your empathy starts to come through. But then you start to realize that, like there is no judgment, and there is no, there's no hate, because what's happening is people are manifesting that trauma, or they're manifesting that stress as a behavior. So you can dislike the behavior, but that doesn't mean that the person is not a good person, right?
Yeah, yeah, great, great insight. I have no judgment. People often say to me, I find it hard to believe that you don't have any judgment on whatever certain behaviors. I'm like, I have no judgment. How can I possibly judge another person? Because I don't know. Like you
Absolutely.
said, and childhood trauma, it comes in so many forms, and honoring that so that we can
Mhm.
help people to escape it. Yeah, we don't do a good job on that, and I know that yours would have been very, very different to mine, completely different.
Absolutely. So if I could share, so like I finished work at the end of 2022. I was made redundant from my job, which I'd been preparing for a couple of years. And given I'd been there for 16 years, I was like, prying my dead fingers off before I resign, right? So took redundancy, which was fine. But it meant I actually got to go to Samoa and spend 10 weeks with my mother in Samoa, which was, hugely valuable and informative. And I understood for Samoa and the family better and all of those different things. And I say that because that was January of 2003. And then she passed at the end of July 2003. And I only say that because she was my hero growing up, like as a single mother of two children. The moment when I was 17 and she was able to afford our first house is my most proud moment ever, right? But actually, in talking to my Vedic astrologer, I had to unpack the fact that I felt abandonment with her. And so, to your point, it's a total mind screw,
Mm,
to think about the fact that this person who's your hero, who you, as far as you're concerned, could do no wrong, you felt resentment towards, and then you have to your point, honor it, unpack it, then forgive it. Gosh, I mean, everybody needs to go through their own journey for whatever that might look like, but that's true healing at its best, right? That's one thing
mm,
to say you're a healer of other people, but if you can figure out how to get people to heal themselves, I mean, that's true blessing.
yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you got that time with your mum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand the trauma and the resentment coming together. I mean the honoring and the resentment with your mum.
Well, again, there's a really simple book called Healing the Soul Scars by a woman by the name of Lise Bourbeau. Again, really simple read, but that's what it says, is that we're all born with one of four major scars. And that if you understand what those scars are, and you work through it, again, whether that's Buddhist philosophy, whether it might be, it just leads you to a happier place, right?
Mm,
Because more often than not, the trauma and the scar that you might hold could be with the person that you love the most in the world. That was my,
mm,
learning. And so, look, again, everybody needs to unpack themselves. And to your point, I spent 10 plus years doing it. But really, it's only the last couple of years where I've started to feel like I've got agency in terms of, how I'm feeling about it. So again, when I see people and I do hypnotherapy with them, or they talk to me about different things, and I say, look, I still haven't cracked this. I started to crack it probably when I was like 52. You're 35, you're 28, you're 40. So you should be thankful about the fact you've got decades on me yet to figure it out, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's definitely hard work. All right, so you've recently, was it just recently you've been made redundant from Edelman? Is that right?
End of 2022, yeah.
Yeah. So, and you've done some pretty interesting stuff since then. Tell us about what you've been doing and what
So
you're going to do as well.
yeah, sure. So again, I guess the phrase that I'd use is dharma, right? Or life purpose. It's probably the best way to describe it. And so, as I started going through the work to figure out what my life purpose was, I very quickly realized that travel and connection with people was really important for my growth. again, you come from a country like New Zealand. When the first time I turned up into London in 1993, and I remember seeing a building that was like from the 1400s and thinking, wow, that's like already 400 years older than my country, right? And so you don't think about history and you don't think about culture and you don't think about the context. And so, yeah, everything happens for a reason. I went hiking in New Zealand in January for 6 weeks. And I did six of the 10 biggest day hikes in New Zealand. Had never pitched a tent before, had never slept on the ground before, braved the elements or whatever it was. But it's just what I had to do in order to do that camping trip. And then the next thing you know, I was off to like Greece and Cyprus to catch up with some friends. And then while I was there, I was like, okay, well, what can I do to honor my Dharma? And so I found an overland trip that started in the middle of April, uh, that finished in Singapore September 30th, but was 19 countries: Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Iran, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, China, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. And so how does that trip fit into this kind of, I guess, journey of self-discovery? I guess it was really a couple of things. One of which is there are certain countries that you hear about, like the Stan countries. I've never been to a country that finished with the word Stan, right, which means land of. And now I've been to five of those seven, and that's the history of the world there. And so I was keen to dig into that a little bit more. And then you can only do it via truck. And so I guess the community element of being in a truck with 20 other people, sharing the cooking duties, sharing the cleaning duties. And again, in 3 months, I slept in a tent like 60 days. So again, that experience in New Zealand paid forward to what I was doing at that point. Um, but I guess, three things that, as I still think about the world that we're in, back to what I said before about, how everyone's doing the best they can. You go to a place like Iran, and you talk to people there, and they know there's all this geopolitical stuff going on. But they don't care about it. They just want, a simple life, and they want a good future for their children, and they want to dance and they want to be happy. It's exactly the same when you go to a place like Turkmenistan, which is quite locked down, or China, or whatever it might be. And so I think, I've really removed a lot of my judgments and prejudices when it comes to other people, right? In
Yeah.
other parts of the world, which was really important. Then the other part to that, I think, was that once I've never had an appreciation really of history, for example. But then once you start thinking about the fact that, in the Silk Road, which was what that tour was called, that people back in the 1300s were getting on camels and going across these sand dunes for like months and months on end, just delivering products. Again, your appreciation of the human spirit is out of this world, right?
Mm.
And then finally, I think, I was, as you were, brought up in a very westernized viewpoint of history. And I'd already started looking into African history and Indian history. But once you get to places like, for example, to Tajikistan, where the Tajiks are very, proud of their history, and they were, had amazing astronomy capabilities, back in the 1000s, you start to realize that there's a lot out there in the world that we don't know when it comes to what history looks like. And so I guess that desire to go and figure those parts out was fascinating for me as well. I mean, look, so many great experiences, but I'll continue this on. I'm actually leaving tomorrow night to go to 42 weeks to drive around Africa.
Mm.
And so that's part of this continued journey of, I guess, understanding people, working in community with people, but most importantly, understanding myself through that journey as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's brilliant. And that's the reason I rushed getting this done is because you're going tomorrow. I didn't realize it was tomorrow. But for travel for me has been the same. So
Mhm.
when 1992, I think, yeah, 92, I jumped on a plane and went Egypt, Israel, and Jordan. Yeah. And 95, it was India, China, Nepal. And it's exactly what you're saying. You realize wherever you go, everyone actually wants the same things.
Absolutely.
Everyone.
And so look, there was one point when Erevan in Armenia, and I'm standing in front of this big world map with a guy by the name of Norman Handy, who's written multiple books about travel, who was part of my tour. And he's starting to tell me about these countries that I don't know. And I said, how many countries have you actually been to, Norman? And he goes, 124, which is the first time I actually sat down and wrote down how many countries I'd been to, which at that point had been 36. But most of it was for business travel, right? So,
Yeah.
again, like I'd been to New York 50 times, LA 40 times, London 40 times. You start to realize it's travel, but it's not a conference room is a conference room, hotel room is a hotel room. But when you're actually spending time with people, which is all that really matters, when
Yeah.
you're out and doing these experiences, it's a completely different perspective on everything, right?
Yeah. No, it's peace of mind, just disconnection, just letting your mind float into different sort of ideas and thoughts. And but tell me, is the most dangerous thing that happened on your trip so far?
Well, so I'm in Mashhad in northeastern Iran, and I had this amazing tour guide who worked at the university and was a lecturer around Persian history and Sufism and poetry. And so he was showing me around. We were going to these amazing tombs and seeing all of these great things. A real highlight for me in the trip was we went to the tomb of Firdaus, who I've never even heard of. But in 1100, he wrote a book called Shahnameh, which basically captured Persian culture and language. And if he hadn't written that book and if people hadn't kept it alive, then the Persian language would have been lost, for example. So he's revered. And so we went there, and the curator of the Firdaus Museum like my tour guide spoke to him, and then he did this very dramatic reincarnation of a couple of passages of Ferdows's play, right? Which I got on video, and he did specifically for me. I was like, wow. But anyway, me being me, I said to him, okay, I know like Afghanistan's just over there on the border. Is there any way that I can go and see Afghanistan? And so he said, oh, we'll see what we can do. So we drove the 40 minutes to the Afghan border, and we walked through the customs checkpoint. And the mistake he made was that he was filming me as I was walking through the customs checkpoint. Thank goodness my phone wasn't out. And the next thing you know, this Lada pulls up, and this guy says, oh, come with me, please, to him. And as a member of the customs police. And then we had to go and sit there with him. And he keeps on coming out every 5 minutes going, yeah, everything's great. Everything's okay. He goes, oh, we just got to talk to their boss who's coming over. So this guy comes over, tall guy, beard, strong shoulders. And he, talks to me very gruffly, trying to figure out why I'm there at the border of Afghanistan and Iran. I tell him, oh, look, I'm trying to sort out tours for the future to Iran. And then all of a sudden, after 25 minutes, and he even said to me, I had a beard at that point, he goes, you sure you're not Iranian? Right? So, well, okay. And then eventually he goes, yeah, that's right. Since the Taliban's been in charge, tourism's opening up, it's much more settled. Women were walking across the border without hijab, for example. And he goes, okay, well, I'll get one of my guys. So I've got this great photo of me standing 5 meters away from the Afghanistan border checkpoint on the other side with the Taliban flag flying on the background. But the reason that it's scary is because it wasn't until after he had gone that my tour guide told me that he was a member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So again, if you told me that beforehand, my judgments would have spiraled out of control, and I probably would have stumbled and kind of mumbled through the entire thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I tell that story to friends of mine, and they're just kind of like, "Did anyone know that you were there?" And I'm like, "No."
Oh,
So
that's awesome.
it could have gone pear-shaped, very pear-shaped.
Oh,
Um,
well, I hope Africa's awesome, and I look forward to having a drink and catching up with you when you get back from that. Just hearing about all the adventures. Just be safe, medically. Be medically safe. Obviously, there's a lot of risks
Well, as I
there.
said, these things all happen for a reason, right? I'm going
Yeah,
from never having spent a night into a tent. In terms of 326 days, it would be like 250 days in a tent driving around Africa.
yeah.
But I feel prepared, and I feel really excited for it. If anything, I wanted to go to Africa before I went to Central Asia. And so apparently the first 3 months through Western Africa will be very mentally taxing,
Mm.
and not easy. One guy was telling me one day they were just digging the truck out all day, and they went 4 kilometers. But in some ways, I think that's why you do these things, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You do it again for the experience and to learn a lot about yourself. And so, yeah, look, to your point, I think, one of the things that, well, one of the key moments for me was COVID, right? I got really fit during COVID because there's very little else to do. I still remember early on sitting there thinking, I need to kind of put down the whiskey bottle and put down the cigarettes. Otherwise, this is not going to be a good couple of years. So I went running. And I only say that because I know that, many people our age, in their 50s, that they're going through a lot of struggles, right? And so, whether it's trying to keep their jobs, whether it's just trying to kind of be fit, whether it's trying to keep everything together. I guess that would be one of my primary messages is that at any age, you can simplify your life down,
Mm.
find a way to do the things that makes your heart happy. But the first thing you do is figure out what makes your heart happy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm talking about making sure you got all your vaccines up to date that you need,
All that.
typhoid, all that sort of good stuff. All right, so let's change tack
Yeah.
because you worked at Edelman. So the
Mhm.
trust barometer is something I tracked for years and years and years, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. But then also Edelman's also getting more and more attacks on its ability to be considered a trustworthy reporter on trust, considering it's working with a lot of fossil fuel companies. So it's been a bit of a shaky relationship with the press in the last couple of years on that front. But we've got some trouble. We're seeing it in the US at the moment. Jeff Bezos this week with not endorsing Trump through the Washington Post, and how the media headlines, nobody trusts the press anymore. And that's a pillar that we need. We need media trust. We need to trust governments. We need to trust the business and charities and the institutions that sort of run our societies. And it's probably one of my great fears if we don't get on top of this, where when our societies won't be resilient for the risks we face. So we can learn how to be more resilient, but we need resilient societies, healthcare, education, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, let's talk about trust. So where do you want to start this one?
Well, I guess again, the diagnostic of trust is an incredible thing in terms of giving you a sense of what's going on. But I guess I would say for me, it helps inform broadly what's going on in terms of people's minds, right? And so, so when I look at the stresses and the trauma that people are going through, and I look through the transformational world, for one of no better jargonistic word, but it's very real. People are scared, right?
Mm,
And so if you can't trust that you're going to keep your job like you could in the 50s and you had a job for life, and if you can't trust that you can buy a house, and if you can't trust that you can find a relationship where you're clear about whatever the dynamics are within that relationship, it just makes you scared. And I think that's really what I would say about trust and what's going on in the world is that there are so many scared people who are lost. And that manifests itself into reactive behaviors, right? Back to what I
mm.
said to you before. You can, if you start by hating the behavior but trusting the soul of the person, then we can get somewhere. But I think somehow we've started connecting behavior and people and then doing it in a very generic way and saying, okay, right, this group of people are bad, that group of people are bad. And unfortunately, and I grew up believing that the media truly was, above the fold. The media just makes it worse, right?
Yeah.
So in some ways, the Bezos piece for me, once I saw his opinion article, and he's just like, let's just not kid ourselves. Nobody cares about who we are because they don't trust us. And how do we find a way to restore that trust? He's not wrong, right? I don't know what the answer is, but clearly it wasn't working the way that it was. And look, I just hope we just get this election out of the way in the US and that there's peacefulness and there's unity. Doesn't look like it at this point. But again, one of the reasons is that nobody trusts that the process is fair. Nobody trusts that the dialogue is fair. Nobody trusts that the people have people's best intention in heart. It's a scary world we live in when it comes to that lack of trust in terms of how people react to it, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting that where you started with people are scared because what they think they have a right to work towards is not possible or they can't achieve it, right? So it's interesting that you started there because when you look at like how the world is evolving, especially when you bring the climate into the story, um, like
Mhm.
I bought a house in my 20s and I was very happy to get rid of it and never wanted to go back there because even in my 20s, I could see that long-term sort of dream, the Australian middle class dream or whatever the dream is based on wherever you grew up. It didn't ever make any sense to me as being a long-term possibility. And that was just an insight I had for whatever reason. Um, and so I see a lot of people, they're scared of the future because they can't have what, we're the last generation that remembers what it was like before technology. We're also the last generation that remembers when those dreams were more mainstream and now it's not. And so,
Yep.
when you look at lack of trust in the institutions and you look at the politicians' roles in that, the media's role in that, um, they're not telling an honest story to people, and which is therefore feeding into this fear and projection and everything else that we're seeing going on. So, but even the ones that we can trust aren't trusted because they're buying into a rhetoric that suits somebody, but it doesn't actually suit them. So, it's like, why would anyone vote for Donald Trump? Because it's not in your own interest, ultimately, right? But
Yeah.
if you're a pro-Trump supporter, you'd attack me for saying that. But that's where I sit there. How can you trust someone who does not genuinely seem to care for anyone but himself? And the psychologists are out there talking about it. Everyone's talking about it now. But I don't know. So
Yeah, but again, like I was chatting to one of the American guys on my tour group, right? And he goes, "Well, what do you think of the election?" And I said, simply put, we're in a post-COVID world where inflation went through the roof, and economy is always the number one decision factor. So if
yeah,
you feel as though you can't afford what you used to afford, then you get angry at the incoming party. You've only got to look at the UK to see what happened with the Conservatives there, right? And so that's what I mean. We kind of dress these things up. But if economy is the number one concern, and if feeling that you're worse off now than you were 4 years ago is the number one concern, and it says that for 32% of voters it is the number one concern, then there's really only one realistic outcome. It's a reaction, right? And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but simply put, coming back to this idea of trust. You can boil it down to who do you trust is going to make your life better in whatever framing that you want to describe being your life better. And if that person doesn't demonstrate what you would describe as proper character, then the other thing you ask yourself, and this is again, as a student of communication, I find it's interesting, right? Donald Trump, for example, you know who he is, right? There's like he's been around forever, and especially as a politician over the last 8 years, he is who he is. So with that comes an authenticity. You know what you're getting. But for
mm,
the rest of the career politicians, like they can say the right things. They can soundbite it. I mean, again, as a student of communications, having done so many media training pieces, and I'm like, this is so media training, and people can see straight through it. So there's an element of, who do you trust to be a real person when they're presenting themselves? And I think that's for me one of the things that will come out of this election is that, this idea that you can hide behind a soundbite and this idea that you can, just deliver, the same three talking points over and over again and think that that's people are going to be happy with that. I just don't think that's the case anymore, right?
yeah,
Again, you look at long form podcasts. Do I believe they've had that much impact on this election? Not really, but media hasn't had that much either. But do I believe in the future that they're going to have much more impact? Yeah. But for an executive who's used to a 3 to 5 minute CNBC interview where, they're asked three questions and they dodge two of them, it's not that world anymore, right?
yeah. No, it's an interesting perspective. So you don't think the Democrats have risen to the moment, especially in the last few weeks?
Uh,
Because I,
no,
I feel,
no, no,
no,
actually.
okay,
And so I'll tell you why. Because if the economy is the number one concern, right, then bang on about the economy. But the challenge is for the average person, they're like, you've been doing this for 4 years and you've been doing it for 12 of the last 16. Why haven't you done it already? So then you pivot off to what's the third most important point, which is abortion, right?
mm,
And so, like, do I believe that they've risen to what most elections are almost always about? Back to Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid? Not even close.
okay,
Because
interesting.
mm, because because again, when it was the world of Bidenomics, which no one ever says anymore, right?
Hmm.
Or when they go on and they defend their economic record, which they can, nothing changes the fact that eggs are 50% more expensive than they were 4 years ago, right?
Yeah.
It's just people's lived experience is different to what you're told.
Well, I'm based on everything I'm seeing and observing and tracking, I believe that the Democrats will win with a landslide, and it's not because of the economics. I think the abortion issue is massive. I think women's rights is a massive issue. Obviously, I think they screwed up on the Latinos big time this week, and they're trying to distance themselves. But they saw the script. They knew what was going to be said.
But
Um,
here's an alternative viewpoint for you, right? Which I find fascinating again. So the 2020 election was the Donald Trump election. You either voted for him because you loved him, or you voted against him because you hated him, right?
yeah,
And so they had 163 million people vote. The highest voter turnout since like the 30s and 40s. So you could argue that Donald Trump, for all his foibles, is making democracy more real, and he's bringing people out to vote, right? So again, if the Democrats win, there's a good chance that one of the reasons they'll win is because people just hate Donald Trump. But it doesn't change the fact that whatever the catalyst is for democracy and getting people off the couch to vote, that's a good thing.
yeah, yeah. Especially in countries where you don't have to vote, right?
No, so for example, the 2016 election, I think it was 140 million people, right? So there's an extra 20 plus million people who turned up in 2020. And
Mm.
that's what an active democracy looks like. Doesn't mean that it actually necessarily works. But much like Australia, where you turn up for the freedom sausage and you cast your vote and it's mandatory you vote. Like participation rates in places like the UK and the US were and are terrible.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons when you look again at the trust barometer and you look at the least trusted country, the UK is the least trusted country
Mm.
of the 28 that they track, and the government is just not trusted at all. The USA is the fifth least trusted. So we see it from a very interesting perspective of a place like Singapore, for example, where you could argue that there are certain foibles that kind of like part of the environment, but is the government trusted? Absolutely, it is. So
Yep.
yeah, how do you find that right balance? I hope that post this election you do, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, definitely looking at the trust barometer across Asia and just being able to live in a society where you're just not feeling this constant antagonism and anger and rage. Everyone's sort of getting on along all right. Every now and again, these little bursts, that happen, but pretty much, it's what they designed the society for, to be multiracial and everyone gets along. I think they've done an amazing job. But even in India, there's trust. In China, there's trust. I mean, you look across Asia, it's consistently they're up higher in the trust bracket. Not
And
all countries, but
no, and look, the other part to that is again, I believe that there's a lack of trust about government and the system because, what Kamala Harris has $1.1 billion she's spending. Donald Trump's got 400 million. And so what are they going to spend it primarily on? Advertising and all the rest of those things. But there's just way too much, corporate interest money in politics, right?
yeah,
And so, again, just kind of taking that out of the system so people don't believe that, for example, if you get a big donation from a corporate entity, so therefore they're going to define your technology policy, your healthcare policy, or whatever. That's where, again, Singapore has none of that. There's no lobbying money in Singapore, as a case in point. And I've got to think that's a good thing, right?
yeah, absolutely. All right, final question. Um, I I call it the Manosphere.
Oh yeah,
And one of the chapters in my book, I talk about the fact that we need manbassadors. So the good men of the world to rise up and really sort of show men what it is to be a man, a good man in the world. I'm raising two sons. One of my big priorities is teaching them to respect themselves, respect others, to be kind and compassionate. And I get lots of compliments for my boys, which I'm proud of. I don't take it as anything I've done. It's just their character. But also we're focused on it as parents because it's important. But we've got a problem. I think we've got a problem with females too. So I'm not just bagging men. I think, but there's women's equality is obviously on the table, and women are stretching out and rising up, and I'm all for that. But how we go about it matters. And as a result, we're seeing the rise of the incel movement. Obviously, violence towards women in Australia. It's like one woman a week's being killed by a domestic partner.
awful.
There's a lot of rage, a lot of anger. A lot of the European elections, young men predominantly are moving towards the right, the far right, which, to me is not in their interest when we look at history. And obviously, not knowing your history is obviously a bit of a problem. Um, there's big DEI pushback, especially from the right, and that's a concern. So there's a lot of othering. I mean, it's a terrible time. So for you and the journey you've been on, and the man that you are, and the man that you'll become and are becoming. When you talk to the men of the world, what's your wisdom that you've learnt on the journey? And then when you talk to the younger men of the world, what would you say to them too?
Look, the first thing is I'm just a member of the human race, like we all are, right? And along with being non-judgmental, I believe we're all equal. And so, look, I'm a bit more experienced, but I think the first thing I do is I still remember, like, Martin Luther King Jr. back in the 60s. He would say, "This is not a black problem, this is not a white problem, this is a poverty problem," right? Is that if we find the right phraseology where it's kind of like not necessarily about gender, or it's not necessarily about um, again, it's very easy to perceive something like DEI as a rebalance, right? Because again, and this was the Martin Luther King issue, as people would say, well, you've been given lots of money since the Emancipation Proclamation, but if I give you more, then what are you taking out of my pocket, right? So I
Mm,
think the first thing that you've got to do is you've just got to understand why people are scared about this stuff. And you've got to ask the question as to what is it that would make you feel more secure? Coming back to what I said, if you do believe that it first and foremost comes from a place of fear, which again, everything comes from a place of fear or love, right? Then understanding those fears, because unfortunately, again, back to the media piece, like, to scold certain groups and say that you're doing something wrong, or to, again, I'll use the example of the BBC. I love the BBC, right? It's still it's if I hear something and I'll cross-reference, as we all should, all of the different pieces, I'll still look at the BBC, and if the BBC covers it, I'm like, it's true. But if you compare how they covered the Tate brothers and Andrew Tate versus Hugh Edwards and the litany of BBC commentators who are done for historical and recent paedophilia crimes, there's just a lack of connection there, right?
mm,
So again, I think that there's this bashing of some of the messages that are positive messages because there are misogynistic and other elements to it as well. I just ask, what are you scared about? And then the next thing is, what can you control? And,
mm,
and and coming back to my journey, the phrase that I'd use is agency. I started to get agency on myself, and I managed to be able to kind of like control how I felt about things. So control how I felt about things is probably the wrong way to describe it, but I used to be able to use the Viktor Frankl, like maps of meaning approach, where he'd say between stimulus and response, there's a space, right? And so how do you get people to understand that there is this space where when something happens, that one, they get to choose who they are when they respond. There's just not this automatic anger, to your point. And secondly, how do you help them to understand what the best version of themselves might be in doing that? So I say that because if you're a young man, and especially a young white man in today's world, you feel under attack, right? Back to what I said before, you feel as though, like, before your path was so clear. You were most likely to find a job, you were most likely to find a partner, you're most likely to do these things. White male privilege is a real thing, and I say that as somebody who probably benefited from it growing up, even though I never considered myself a white male, right? But if that's not there anymore, then what do you replace it with?
mm.
And so I think you're right. Women and men and poor people and rich people, and people who are discovering themselves. Firstly, you hope that we're in a better world where we can have the conversation about it. Like I still say to friends, I spoke to my sister about this when I was back in New Zealand, where I said she won't let her 16-year-old daughter walk down the street by herself, go to school by herself, right? And I went through the stats. I said, you do realize that, like, violent crime is way down, for example. You do realize that, like, sexual assault is way down. Go through the statistics, but nothing will change her mind that it's just not safe out there. But the answer is it is safer out there. Whether we're seeing it more, whether we're feeling it more, how do we make people know that, for example, that they're generally safer now than they are? And then how can we unpack that fear and give them something about themselves, a worldview, and an understanding, a meaning that makes them feel as though that they can succeed in whatever their way they want to succeed. And then finally, the other question that I talk to young men about is what are you doing to physically get yourself ready for the future? Right.
Mm.
Whether it's the world of AI or whether it's the kind of like, oncoming kind of like robot pieces or whatever, the first thing you've got to be able to do is you've got to be able to be physically fit and sleep well to be able to deal with these things. Because if you're not sleeping well and if you're drinking too much and you are, doing all of those things that lead to stress, it's just going to get worse. So a long way of basically saying that what they feel is real because the world's changing around them. What women feel is real because it's changing around them. And that how do we get people to a place of safety and how do we get people to a place of, again, self love? That's what we need to figure out. And I
Yeah.
just don't think we do enough of that stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
For example, I've been learning to day trade for 4 years, and I'm like, why don't we have financial literacy in school? It's the most obvious thing you can have. Now that we've got meditation in school, I think that's great. But how do we get self psychology and self perspective at a young age into people's hearts and minds? Unless we do that, everyone's just going to get angrier and angrier, right? Because they're
Yeah.
going to perceive things getting taken away from them.
Yeah. And the data doesn't actually back up white men losing out. Yeah,
No,
yeah,
no.
yeah. So
I still remember, and that's what I mean, perception versus reality, right? I still remember when there was a big DI push in Australia, and at that point there was 14 of the ASX 500 CEOs were women. I think today that number's 9. So you're
yeah,
absolutely right. The data does not point out that things are being taken away, but there's a perception, right?
yeah,
And in,
yeah,
in our world, perception is reality. Couldn't agree
yeah.
more.
But it was really good that you started off with fear because that, to me, that's the cornerstone of the problem. Like, there's so much reason to sit in fear today, whether it's a fear for the future from a career and opportunity perspective or from a climate collapse and civilization collapse perspective. I mean, there's a lot of things to fear. So I did a show on climate courage where we talked about the
Hmm.
most important thing you can do is get yourself to a state of acceptance. And that
Yes.
means that you've looked at all the possible scenarios that could befall us, and you accept that that's potentially the path that we take. So there's a lot of dark humor in it because you sort of listen to announcements of what governments are going to do or not do, and you're just like, oh, all right, then we're on that path, and you accept it. So you don't sit in fear. So acceptance is important. But the
Yeah,
other
so,
thing
so
is
so
is
just on that point,
systemic.
if I can,
Yeah,
so like I said, I started learning to trade in 2024, like profitable, good work, right? But as part of that, and this being a student of history that I talked about before, you start looking at economic cycles, right? You start looking at 18.6 year real estate cycles and contractive waves and 80-year long cycles and those kinds of things. And to your point, that'll scare the Jesus out of you because basically it all says that 2026, 2027, it's just all going to hell in a handbag. But from a trading perspective, you're like, I know that, I accept that. I'm not scared of that. In some ways, it's one of the reasons why I'm going to Africa for a year because I'm kind of like, I expect the next year to be messy and that we'll start to see what the future looks like at the end of that. So I'd rather be on the road figuring out the next generation if we see the next generation, because is there a likely war? Hopefully not a nuclear, decisive war in our future. Most likely. But does that mean that you don't live your life? No. But I think for most people, it would paralyze them, right? That
yeah,
sense. Couldn't
yeah.
agree more.
You got to step out of the fear, but also addressing the systemic problems, right?
Yep.
Mental health is a massive issue. It's a growing issue. It's only going to get worse. So my 16-year-old told me, I'm going to do mental health at uni, and I'm like, awesome. That is a career that is going to be flourishing in the future. So there's no question in my mind, because that's what we need. So building resilience now, if you can, going camping for the first time if you've never done it, putting
Oh,
yourself in
look.
uncomfortable situations, right?
So I was getting really fit last year, and then about 2 weeks into November, I got an email saying, oh, get ready for the Standard Chartered Marathon, which I'd signed up for 5 months previously. And I was like, oh, I haven't even trained for it. That would be stupid. But then I'm like, I've been doing yoga, I've been doing HIIT, I've been doing cardio. So I did the marathon. But to your point, it's kind of like, how do we have that mindset that says, okay, you're not stupid about it, but you will push yourself to do the things that, that you don't think are possible. Because if you'd said to me 10 years ago that, that as a rugby player that I could do distance as opposed to doing 100-meter sprint, I would have laughed at you, right? Did it in 5 hours and 20 minutes. Couldn't have been prouder.
Oh, good on you. Yeah, I won't say publicly why I don't run marathons, but there's let's just say women with large breasts are not often seen on the marathon finish line. For
That's a
very good
very good
reason.
point, Andrea. Very good point.
I think that's a good spot to stop it. All right, so when you come back, we'll catch up and hear all about it, and I'm sure I'll be looking forward to hearing the epiphanies.
Yeah, look, and like I'll share my so I've decided for this trip, I'll set up a YouTube channel, right,
Yes,
whereby I'm sharing those epiphanies and sharing the reality of what's going on in Africa with regards to innovation and people, because when you look for it, there's not a lot there. So again, we all say it's the up and coming continent, and it's the place that that where all the opportunity lies, but I think a lot of people are actually interested in what's actually going on in the ground. So let me get on the ground and figure it out.
I can introduce you to some environmentalists on the way. You're going through Uganda?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. I know a few guys there. They're really awesome. So I'll hook
That's
you up.
perfect.
All
Connections
right.
are always good. All right, Andrea. Well, as always, a pleasure.
Yeah.
We won't keep it so long next time, but I really appreciate the chat.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful evening. I love to the family too.
And safe and successful travels, my friend. All right. See you guys.
Take care.
I'm coming